Alright, so the next thing is we're gonna add some environment elements, some environment model onto our scene. So what I'm gonna go to is download this 3D game kit environment pack from the asset store. Right, so it will take some time for you to download this. So I already downloaded this and I've already imported this into my game assets over here, or my game project over here. And there's a lot of things that we can use. There's rocks, whole bunch of rocks that we can use, vegetation, large, medium, small. So there are some small vegetations, like I guess some alien mushrooms over here that we can use, up to large trees and stuff like that. Some of these are like alien looking trees. So I guess what we're going to do next is to kind of like populate our terrain with some of this environment pack that we have. So one of the ways that we can do it is to use the paint trees on our terrain over here. Alright, so if I go on to our terrain over here and I go ahead and click edit tree, add tree, I can assign an object to be the tree. So by default there's two of these trees that Unity gave us already, but you can of course use other props. Like for example, if I were to use this mushroom vegetation small model over here and click on add, I can play around with the brush size, the tree density, basically how many of those trees, if it's going to be a lot or quite little, the height of it, I can choose for it to be a random height. And if I were to just paint it across the map, as you can see, I will have a whole bunch of those model around the map. Alright, now before I actually go ahead and do that, let me just go back to the trees here and let me remove that particular tree. What I want to talk about first are game objects and how does a player collide with certain game objects, and also how to create certain prefabs. So if I were to go to the game environment pack and I look for perhaps vegetation, small, and I look for one of those small vegetation that we had earlier, or perhaps I use this one instead. Alright, and I import this to our Unity scene. Now first things first is I kind of need to compare it in relative to my character, so perhaps I can make it slightly larger. Right, and perhaps I'll put it somewhere here. Now the thing is that we can try to eyeball this and try to match it quite perfectly, but sometimes it might not be perfect still, or we can kind of use Control Shift and try to snap it to the ground. Right, so if let's say you have your model somewhere in mid-air, just press Control Shift and snap it towards the ground so that you can get a slightly better result. Right, now given because the terrain is a little bit bumpy, so some parts of the model, depending on what kind of model you have, might not be visible. So let's just say I have something like this for now. Perhaps I can just scale it up slightly. I just want to make sure that this guy is being seen as well, so let me just scale them up a little bit more. Alright, so at least I can see a little bit of this guy over here. I can push it up a bit more, and yep, alright, that will do for now. So what I can do is I can now go ahead, let's go back to perspective. I can now go ahead and create certain colliders. So that means that when my player kind of bumps in to this particular game object, he or she won't be able to go through it. So right now, if I were to play the game, you'll notice that I just run by this particular object. So what we need to do is to create certain box colliders so that the player won't be able to go through these objects. So we'll go and select the prefab that we had earlier, and we're going to head on the add component and look for a box collider. Alright, so we have a box collider here which kind of surrounds the box over here. We can go ahead and click on this button, which is the edit box collider, and try to match this a little bit better. Alright, it doesn't have to be exactly perfect, but somewhere around there. And then once that's done, if I were to go ahead and run this again, alright, you notice that it still goes through. That's because of a few reasons. First things first is this particular vegetation needs to be on the environment layer. If not, Unity won't identify it to be not the enemy but the environment. Number 16, and they'll say yes, I'll like to change to the children as well. So when I run this, as you notice that I can't go through this particular vegetation because there is the box collider. Alright, so now that we have this particular object to be the box collider, we can now make him or make it into a prefab. So in order to do that, all you gotta do is to drag the assets from the hierarchy onto the projects folder, and they say, would you like to create a new original prefab or a variant of this prefab? So I'll just say I'll create an original prefab, and perhaps I can rename this to maybe new vegetation or something that I would recognize. Alright, and we can for now do away with this old one. So now if I were to go to the terrain and click on paint trees, edit tree, add a tree, and I will look for this new vegetation prefab that I've created earlier. Click on add. Okay, so we might need to kind of play around with the brush size and the tree density, so we're able to kind of populate this area with a whole bunch of this vegetation. So you can kind of like go in here and try to populate as much of this area with this particular type of vegetation. Alright, so we have a bunch of this across the map, and when we actually run and play the game, you notice that all of them have box colliders and we cannot really go through them. Just one other trick is, if I were to just bring my brush size down and have a tree density of about 10, and even I just tap it once everywhere around the map, it's still quite a lot of this mushroom planting. So one of the tricks we can do is to increase the brush size and just do a gentle tap once across the field, so that it will look quite randomly spread out, and I think that's quite enough amount of mushrooms across the map. If you don't like it, you can just Ctrl Z to undo and try it again, and you will kind of randomly generate another set of so-called mushrooms. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is we want to start to create boundaries across the map. Right, so we want to start to think about where is the start position and where is the end position perhaps, and also just to ensure that the player is unable to jump out of the map. So this is one of the HCI design principles within creating games or creating any kind of software, which is to constrain the user or constrain the player within the map. Alright, so as you can see, if I were to go over here, I can basically go down and kind of like die. So what we want to do is to use all of the assets inside the environment pack and start to decorate the whole area over here. Now one more thing before we get started, I just want to show you about the directional light. Is if I were to select the directional light under the lighting and I use E to rotate it, I can kind of change the light settings a little bit. Alright, so for a directional light, there isn't any much effect on the light if I were to move it up and down, left and right. Direction light only change with rotation. Alright, so it kind of mimics the sunlight. And of course, when you select the direction light, you can change the things like color, intensity over here. But we'll talk about this a little bit more later on. So for now, let's go ahead and create some of the environment around to create the borders. So let's just explore what we have here. So we have, if you go back to the environment pack, we have rocks, and you have some rocks model over here. So one of it would be like this cliff thingy here, and you have some kind of iconic landmark like a temple, a door over here, which I think I might want to use. So let's just put this somewhere where I have quite a bit of dirt which I have created earlier on the terrain. So it's somewhere over here. We can kind of create this. Now the tricky part here is that because it's a terrain and some parts are a little bit hilly, and we want to kind of cover up some of this, so it's kind of up to our creativity how we exactly do that. Because if I were to go all the way down, it covers the stone area. We can come back here and kind of sculpt to make this part here a little bit higher as well. Alright, so I'm just going to set the boundary over here, so basically the player is not even going to see or go near any of these areas. So let's just kind of rotate it a bit. Alright, so something like that. And if you want to cover it up, let me just increase this a little bit more, so there'll be a nice transition between the ground and this rock formation over here. So if you want to tweak it a little bit more, we can always go to our terrain and raise or lower the terrain and kind of raise this area a little bit. Oops, not too much. This area doesn't really matter so much, but just for the aesthetics of it, I'm just going to increase. Okay, so if you need to, you can come back here and smoothen the terrain and stuff like that a little bit later on. So I'm just going to place that over here, and we can start to explore and put in other stuff like this rock over here as well, and try to make it as large as we can. And try to kind of place it accordingly. Alright, so basically it's to kind of fill the entire map with some of these things. It doesn't have to entirely be rocks, it can be some other things as well, like some of the huge plants that is provided over here as well. But the idea is to kind of like find an aesthetic balance between some of these things here. Right, so just to make sure that things make sense, it's not like it suddenly appears out of nowhere, but at the same time we want to cover as much ground as possible with as little assets as possible. Alright, so that the game will be more optimized, so to speak. And at any time you can just go back to our direction light to kind of like tweak this a little bit more if you want more of like afternoon kind of light. Alright, so the idea is to go around and add some of these things across the map. Okay, before we get too carried away designing our map over here, just a few more things to show you and for you to take note of. So first things first is, if I were to go and select the terrain and go to edit the trees, you may notice that I might have some extra trees where I do not want them to be, so I can go ahead and press Ctrl Shift to delete them, delete away some of the trees. Alright, so like I said before, we can just make our brush size bigger and kind of click it once to populate it. But sometimes if you notice that there are some of these trees or some of these mushroom like objects that is perhaps inside the water and we do not want him to be inside the water, so we can go ahead and adjust the brush size, press Ctrl Shift and delete away some of them. Alright, but I'm pretty happy with what I have over here. So that's the first thing for you to take note of. The second thing is, you notice when I run the game, I am able to go through some of the objects which were supposedly there to kind of like keep the player within the boundary of the game. So it's not exactly doing its job, and that's because it does not have a mesh collider or box collider, some sort of collider inside there. So because this is an irregular shape, therefore I would like to use a mesh collider. So we can add a mesh collider over here, and under the mesh we can look for this particular mesh because it kind of fits in together with this. Alright, so it's called Cliff Big 01. So I'll go ahead and look for Cliff Big 01. Alright, so if you notice, there's actually a few of these cliffs. So there is something with the higher poly count, about 9,000 plus vertices, another one which is about over 5,000 vertices, and the other one slightly above 3,000. Alright, so we want to pick the lowest one possible so that our game will be as optimized. So let's click on this one over here. And one more thing to take note of is you gotta change this cliff to be an environment layer. And yes, we'll change the children as well. So now when I run the game, you notice that the character kind of collides with these objects over here. Alright, so I'm able to go through some of these areas here, but once it comes to the bigger part of the rocks and stuff like that, you know, it will collide with it. Alright, so that's one thing to take note of before we actually start to duplicate the whole area here with whatever objects we want them to be. Alright, so let me just go ahead and basically adjust some of these settings over here, and let's go ahead and add the mesh collider for these guys as well. So again, this thing is called rock chunk. So I'll look for the rock chunk, and I want with something with the smallest poly counts, which is this one. Right, and I'm gonna make sure it's an environment layer as well. Okay, so we're gonna have to do this for some of these rocks over here. So that's what I'm going to do as I skip ahead first, so you can go ahead and do that part. Again, if you're not too happy with the position of some of these rocks and stuff like that, it's okay. Let's just put him there first, alright? Just to make sure we have something over there first, and then after that we can go ahead and perhaps sculpt the geometry a little bit more to make sure it kind of like matches together with whatever rock boundaries we have over here. Alright, so I've gone ahead to add all the mesh collider for some of the rocks I have at this corner over here. So this, I guess I'll make this area here to be some sort of the endpoint. So perhaps I'll have my character start the game over here. She would have to cross the map, and in between there will be enemies, and she will have to perhaps collect something over here for her to kind of win the level. Let's go to the add trees over here. Let me just quickly get rid of some of these trees at the corners over here. I probably would not need some of these mushroom like things to be around the corner of the map, since I'm going to have these rocks and some vegetation to be the boundaries instead. Alright, so let's go back here and start to add some more stuff that we can use. Let me just explore a little bit what we exactly have here. So we have things like the ridge over here. I might not want to use that. Perhaps I'll use this one instead. Let me get rid of this. Alright, so I like to use something like this, which is kind of long, so that it covers as much surface area as possible. Alright, perhaps I'll look for this one instead. And let's see what else you have. You have this kind of ridge over here. Let's try to see if this works somehow. Makes sense somehow to put it over here. Alright, so okay, maybe let's just put one more, okay, not a small rock, maybe this guy over here. Rock swarm. Let's bring it back a notch. And let's see what else can we have over here. Cliff edge. Let's make it slightly bigger that way. Okay, so I have a bunch of rocks kind of right in this L shape over here. And first things first, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna kind of like make sure that my terrain fits whatever rocks I've placed over here a little bit better. So I'll go ahead to raise and lower terrain, and first things first, I'll go to my smooth height, and maybe I'll just adjust the brush size to be a bit bigger, not too big, kind of like cover as much of this area over here, and basically smooth. Maybe I just use a simple circle instead. Smooth as much of this area as I can. So you can notice some of them are trying to level out. And then I'll go back to my raise or lower terrain. I'll use some of these other brushes over here. Change the brush size a little bit. And kind of like sculpt it to make sure it kind of fits whatever rock formation that I have already created over here. Now one thing to take note, just to sidetrack a little bit, if you find that some of the UI that comes together with this Allen character set, in a way, you can just go ahead and select this and get them out of the way. Alright, just by unchecking some of these. So whatever it is that you may find that is getting in the way of you know, sculpting your work or doing the terrain and stuff like that, so you can kind of let them get out of the way by just clicking the tick button over there. Okay, so let's go back to this guy here. So just gonna take some time to create something that looks quite well. Maybe I'll just achieve the opacity of it is quite high. Alright, so we don't need to get it to be quite exact now, but just want to make sure that it makes sense and kind of fit the geometry as much as we possibly can let it to be. So I guess I'm pretty happy with that for now. We just move this guy out way a little bit, make it a little bit bigger here. So I guess these are like the medium kind of rocks, and these are like the larger rocks towards the back end over here. Okay, and of course the next thing to do is to go ahead and add all the mesh collider that is needed for this set of models. So let's look for this one, cliff edge 02, which is this guy over here, and I believe this is the smallest one that we can get. Right, so I'm gonna skip ahead and do for all the rest of these rocks formation over here. Basically now is we're trying to add different types of large vegetations over here to kind of like fill the gaps in between some of these rocks over here. Right, just to I'm purely thinking about aesthetics right now. Nothing much about whether it's going to go through or whether the player will kind of like go through some of these areas. So it's purely about aesthetics first at this point of time. Alright, so you can go ahead and just place them all around wherever you find the gaps of perhaps just the large vegetations first, and just placing them around, like for example there's a gap over here, there's some gaps over here, so I'm going to go ahead and place all of this vegetation around the map using some of the models over here first, and not forgetting to change this to become an environment layer, as well as adding a mesh collider component to it. Alright, so we'll get to that. I've gone ahead to add some of these larger vegetations around some of the maps, and as you notice, some of these vegetations are placed right outside the map over here. It kind of like give backdrop, so to speak, of some of these areas. Where you can obviously put more around here, but I'm just going to stick with this for now. And I just want to show you how we can kind of like go in a little bit further and try to add some of perhaps we can look at medium-sized vegetation and add some of these objects right across some of these smaller gaps over here. Alright, just to cover up some of these areas here, so just to ensure that the players would not venture off to somewhere where they shouldn't be going to, which is outside of the map over here. And like I said earlier, we might need to tweak your terrain a little bit more after placing some of this, so that it will kind of like fit nicely to the props that we put inside here. Right, so you can do things like reducing some of these cliffs over here, and just basically scaling and moving them about again using the QWER keys to rotate around or to change around the move, rotate and scale gizmo. Alright, and again it's just basically doing a bit of cleanup and placing them to make sure that they are not perfect but as best as it can be. Like for example, some of this mushroom kind of thing is colliding with the trees that we have over here, so we can go ahead and get rid of them. I can just press shift to erase some of those mushrooms over there, and we can go back to this terrain here and perhaps raise it a little bit so that it kind of matches. Alright, so these are some of the things that we can do to add around here. So you can add medium size and as well as the smaller size vegetation models. Categorized as small over here, so we can go ahead and put some of them right across over here. It might be just slightly larger than those mushroom kind of things that we have added on earlier, and rotating it to see more of the nicer parts of the model. Alright, so just in case if the player were to explore this part of the map, they would be able to kind of see that, hey, this is a pretty nice model, and appreciate that art asset a little bit more. Alright, and also basically going in to fill up some of the gaps. As you saw earlier just now, there was a small gap over there, either by moving your assets or going back to the terrain over here and just raising it a little bit more so that it will fit the context a little bit better. So what we're going to do is again spend some time to just go around and fill up this whole area with some of the medium and larger vegetations to what makes sense. Alright, and again not forgetting to add the environment layer and as well as the mesh collider to these models over here. I've gone ahead and put in some of the medium and small vegetation assets over here, and just something to take note is you don't want to put too much of them, and you just want to try to push them more to the side so that this area here would be so-called the playing field for the player to move about and have the enemy to move about as well, so the enemy can come and look for the player and later try to attack and fight with the player. But we'll do that later on. But for now, I just want to be a little bit more meticulous about the details. So if I were to look in at some of these examples over here. As you notice, there's a gap between some of the models of the mushroom, and some of the things don't exactly make sense. So this is a good time for us to go back to our terrain editor. Alright, and we want to use a really small brush with something which has a smaller opacity to fix some of these areas here. So what I'll do is kind of like smooth the height of the terrain at first. If I were to select terrain, alright. So make sure that the terrain is selected, and let's just smooth the height first, and then from there we can either raise or lower the terrain. Right, so you might want to use a really small opacity over here and just slowly go over some of these areas and be as detailed as you can. Some of these areas here can be smoothened out, and some of these areas can be added, so that as you can see that the things makes a little bit more sense in relation of the terrain to the objects or to the mushroom trees that we have created earlier. So it's gonna take some time to go around and do this, and then after that just come in here and smooth the height. When you do smooth height, perhaps you can just use a much higher opacity so that you will have a greater effect on it. It'll be faster to do it. But when you do raise or lower terrain, you might want to use something that is really low. Alright, so I'm just gonna go around again to make sure that everything kind of makes sense. Again, I must admit this is a bit of a meticulous process. There was a bit of pain to go through while doing this, but yep, you gotta kind of do it to make sure that things are as detailed as we can get it to be. So yep, the next thing is to go around here and even to look at some of these areas over here. At this part of the course, it's supposed to kind of like form over here, and we don't really want to see this part over here. So then again, we want to go inside here and raise all over the textures, or rather the terrain, and use a smaller opacity here and try to match where the rock formation starts to begin and together where the crown is. Right, and then after that, if you want to, you can go ahead and continue to paint again at some of these corners over here. Maybe where the rocks are is where we use some of this texture. If I go to paint textures, so somewhere close where the rocks are is where I want to see more of this brown ground textures, and then slowly as we go towards the center is where it starts to become green again. So these are just some of the tips that we can do, some of the things that we can do to ensure that the thing looks slightly better. Right, so even over here, let me just reduce the brush size a bit more. We can go into make sure the grass kind of goes in a little bit more, and it's just somewhere towards the outskirts of the rocks is where you can use the other one, which is this one over here. Right, so I'm going to go around and basically adjust some of those things that I've talked about earlier, and then once we come back, we can start to create like an acid pool for the water here, where if the player touches the water over here, they will die and then respawn somewhere else.